3. Bishop Butler's Analogy. In Bishop Butler's Analogy, the Thomistic principle of the ability of the natural man by a, quote, reasonable use of reason, end quote, to attain to the truth of the Christian religion was revived and given its classic Protestant formulation, one determinative of most subsequent apologetics. Reason is regarded as arbiter and judge over the meaning, morality, and evidence of revelation and of Scripture. As a result of the analysis of the evidences, Aquinas and Butler both conclude that God probably exists. In the alpha and omega of this methodology, human self-consciousness is assumed to be autonomous, capable of sitting in judgment over God and His revelation, and intelligible without reference to God as creator and interpreter. The conspicuous fact in such thinking is its failure to see man as creature or to take seriously the creator-creature relationship and its implications. If their thinking is true, God is irrelevant to the human situation because He is neither creator nor determiner of things, but only a common participant in being and history. It assumes also to the impartiality and neutrality of man, the covenant breaker. As a result, apologetics based on such an approach fail to present more than a probable God who is a pale shadow and imitation of the God of Scripture, no matter how well-intentioned its hopes and how Calvinistic its theology. The old Princeton method of apologetics was largely indebted to Butler, who in turn was indebted to Thomas Aquinas. Van Til's syllabus on Christian theistic evidences, 1947, explores the fallacy of this position thoroughly. As he points out, quote, facts and interpretation of facts cannot be separated. It is impossible even to discuss any particular fact except in relation to some universal, end quote. Butler distinguishes between probable and demonstrative evidences, probable evidences leading from mere presumption to moral certainty, and demonstrative evidences giving immediate and absolute certainty. Butler believed Christianity to be probably true. According to his outlook, reason could determine, quote, what we should expect from a wise, just, and good being, end quote, and, having determined that, proceed then to see if such a God is presented in Scripture or appears in nature. Thus, Butler declared himself ready to give up Scripture or any part of it, but, quote, let reason be kept too, end quote. However, by beginning with his concept of what reason must expect, he found himself inevitably interpreting all reality in terms of that expectation and finding a certainly probable God in his own reason's image. As Van Til has pointed out, Butler does suppose that the, quote, author of nature, end quote, exists because he thinks rational argument will reasonably establish God's existence. But in his methodology, he ignores that which he supposes, as though this were possible. He assumes a world of brute factuality without order or meaning, and then assumes that an autonomous and unrelated reason is capable of establishing a world which cannot exist on his assumption of autonomy. Quote, what meaning, then, is there in the idea that we suppose an author of nature? Are we not, then, for all practical purposes, ignoring him? In other words, if there is a God presupposed, should not that presupposition control our reasoning? And in that case, can we be empiricists in our method of argument? End quote. This empiricism quickly found its end result in Hume's skepticism. As Van Til has clearly stated, quote, Butler appealed to brute fact. To brute fact, Hume forced him to go. End quote. If he reasoned from brute factuality, he could not assume the facts he intended to prove. If he began as an empiricist, he could not, at his convenience, assume a priori ideas to hold his empirical data together in some convenient universal. Hume, as the more consistent empiricist, forced the issue, and the apologetics of Aquinas and Butler cannot escape the alternative he compelled such apologetics to face. Quote, for Hume, the basic concept of thought is bare possibility, while for one who holds to an author of nature, the basic concept of thought should be God's complete rationality. Butler failed to see this basic alternative. End quote. Consistent empiricism leads to an infinite number of possibilities, which cancel every infinite number of probabilities, as Van Til has shown. Neither could Butler fall back on a non-Christian a priorism because it leads to the same end result. Quote, those who seek to prove the existence of God by an a priori argument of the non-Christian sort prove too much. If they prove the necessary existence of God, they also prove the necessary existence of everything else that exists. The necessary existence of God is said to be implied in the finite existence of man. That is taken to mean, in effect, that necessary existence is a correlative to relative existence, but this in turn implies that relative existence is a correlative to necessary existence. Thus, God comes into existence by the hypostatization of man. Temporal things, together with the evil in them, are then taken as correlative to God. This is destructive of God's unchangeability. God, as well as man, is in this way made subject to change. Thus, we are back at chance as the most fundamental concept in philosophy. A priori reasoning on non-Christian assumptions, no less than a posteriori reasoning upon non-Christian assumptions, leads to the apotheosis of chance and thus to the destruction of predication. End quote. The apologetics of Thomas Aquinas and of Butler and their followers have had their natural consequences and development into unhappy conclusions, yet they flourish, not in philosophical success, but in a continuing appeal to new generations of thinkers. The reason is an obvious one. Arminianism can seek no other foundation and must try to find some kind of security in its untenable position. Within the Roman Catholic Church, Thomism can hold sway by an official decree which arrests its development. Within Arminian Protestantism, without papal fiat, an arrested development is the order of the day. To begin with a consistently Christian position, to begin with the presupposition that the God of Scripture is the true God, has, as Hackett observes, unhappy consequences, landing one in, quote, an extreme Calvinist atmosphere, end quote. It is apparently better to avoid God and Calvinism than to resist the abysmal reaches of impossible probabilities. Thus, Arminian apologetics continue, not in spite of their defects, but because of them. In terms of this, modernist theology has been more honest to its assumptions in following Kantian and existentialist thinking than has been fundamentalism in remaining with Butler. If Thomas Aquinas and Butler are right, then man had better make the most of his autonomy, make himself the measure of reality, and declare that only to be significantly real which he himself can categorize. Quote, there is only one absolutely true explanation of every fact and of every group of facts in the universe. God has this absolutely true explanation of every fact. Accordingly, the various hypotheses that are to be relevant to the explanation of phenomena must be consistent with this fundamental presupposition. God is the presupposition of the relevancy of any hypothesis. End quote. But even modernist theology, having followed Kant, is unwilling to be honest in its claim to autonomy. The biblical terminology, especially with neo-orthodoxy, must be borrowed to cloak the wolf of brute factuality. And again, this is not surprising. Epistemological self-consciousness is the onrushing direction of history, bitterly resisted at every step, and yet forced ahead by the very resistance to it. And, in the face of this, every attempt to return to the arrested development of Aquinas and Butler become more irrelevant to the history of apologetics.